Beneath the dusty towns along Mexico's northern frontier, a hidden world was built, deep underground, far from the eyes of police or military patrols. The cartels constructed secret bunkers. These were not simple hideouts, they were fortified labyrinths of concrete and steel. Inside, cartel leaders held meetings, stored weapons, and planned operations worth billions of dollars. Some bunkers even had electricity, fresh water systems, and escape tunnels stretching for miles, leading across the U.S. border. To many, these places felt less like hideyouts and more like underground kingdoms. For decades, whispers of these hidden chambers spread across border towns, but few dared to speak too loudly. The fear of cartel retribution silenced entire communities. Yet, when investigators and reporters finally uncovered some of these bunkers, the world saw how deeply the cartels had rooted themselves into the land itself. These were not temporary shelters. They were symbols of power. Each bunker told the story of how far organized crime would go to evade justice. And as the years went on, these same bunkers would become the stage for some of the most dramatic captures and extraditions in history. What began as hidden safe houses beneath the soil would eventually turn into prison cells for the very men who once ruled them. 29 cartel leaders exposed. For years, cartel leaders lived like shadows, untouchable, hidden behind walls of money, fear, and loyalty. But when authorities finally struck, the world was stunned to see just how many of these so-called untouchables were dragged into the light. In coordinated operations across Mexico and the United States, 29 of the most powerful cartel figures were exposed. These were not nameless men. They were legends of terror, known in whispers on the streets. Bosses who commanded armies, controlled drug routes, and unleashed violence with a single word. Their faces, once concealed, were suddenly plastered across news screens, their names spoken in courtrooms instead of back alleys. For the first time, the myth of invincibility began to crumble. Each arrest carried a message. No matter how deep the tunnels, how high the walls, or how many men guarded them, the law could still reach them. But exposure did not only mean capture. It revealed the cartel's darkest secrets. The public learned of their underground bunkers, hidden airstrips, and secret financial networks stretching across continents. To their followers, it was a devastating blow. To the world, it was proof that even the strongest criminal empires could bleed. Yet beneath the triumph, one question remained: was this truly the end of their reign, or just the beginning of a deadlier chapter? Tunnels of power. Beneath bustling cities and quiet farmlands, the cartels built their true kingdom, not above ground, but below it. These were no ordinary holes in the dirt. The tunnels of power stretched for miles, connecting Mexico to the United States, carved with precision and reinforced like military bunkers. Some were fitted with electricity, ventilation systems, even rail tracks to move drugs, weapons, and cash faster than any highway ever could. To the cartels, these tunnels were lifelines, invisible veins pumping billions of dollars into their empire. For years, authorities only discovered fragments, collapsed shafts, abandoned passageways, never the full network. But when investigators finally broke into the main arteries, what they uncovered was staggering. The tunnels were proof of the cartel's engineering genius, funded by endless wealth and built with one purpose: control. Entire shipments vanished underground, bypassing borders and scanners with ease. In these dark corridors, the cartels ruled unseen, striking a balance between secrecy and dominance. Every tunnel told a story of ambition and defiance, a hidden war fought in silence beneath the feet of nations. Yet, with each discovery, the myth unraveled. The tunnels symbolized more than smuggling. They showed how far these syndicates would go to remain untouchable, rewriting the rules of power itself. Wealth beyond imagination. From the shadows of crime, the cartels forged empires of staggering riches. Their wealth was not measured in millions but in billions, flowing like rivers of gold from cocaine, heroin, meth, and fentanyl. At the height of their power, they earned more than Fortune 500 companies, making drug lords some of the richest men alive. Palatial estates rose in deserts and jungles, mansions guarded by armies, with private zoos, gold-plated guns, and fleets of exotic cars. Some leaders even built their own private airstrips and submarines to move their treasures across oceans. Yet this wealth was more than excess. It was power. With endless money, cartels bought loyalty, silence, and fear. Politicians, police, and even military units bent under the weight of bribes or the threat of bullets. For ordinary citizens, the sight of cartel wealth was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, proof that crime could defy the state itself. But behind the glittering luxury lay brutality. Every mansion was built on rivers of blood, every jewel paid for with lives lost. The wealth seemed untouchable, limitless, as if no law could ever pierce it. This illusion made cartels appear godlike, above nations and governments. Yet, history shows even wealth beyond imagination carries a price: blood and fear. If wealth was their crown, then fear was their throne. The cartels ruled not only with money but with unimaginable brutality. Blood flowed through streets as messages to rivals, the government, and even ordinary citizens who dared to resist. Murders were not hidden, they were staged as warnings. Hanging bodies from bridges, decapitated heads placed in town squares, and mass graves in remote deserts told the world that disobedience meant death. Fear became the strongest weapon, stronger than any bullet. Families lived in silence, neighbors whispered in shadows, and whole towns were paralyzed by the terror that cartels unleashed. Their killers were young, many just teenagers, armed with assault rifles and driven by loyalty, greed, or desperation. Fear spread like wildfire, burning deeper than any gunfight, reaching the heart of communities. Mothers prayed their sons wouldn't be recruited, fathers hoped not to be extorted, and children grew up knowing violence as a normal part of life. This reign of terror cemented cartel power, making governments hesitate and societies collapse under the pressure. Bloodshed was not senseless. It was calculated, designed to create absolute submission. And for decades it worked. Smuggling empires. Behind the violence and fear lay the true engine of cartel power: smuggling. What began as small groups transporting marijuana and heroin across hidden trails evolved into billion-dollar empires. The cartels perfected the art of moving anything across borders: drugs, weapons, people, even stolen goods. From underground tunnels equipped with lights and ventilation, to speedboats racing across oceans, to private jets and freight containers, no method was beyond their reach. Smuggling routes became arteries of power, pumping cash and influence back into their organizations. Corrupt officials on both sides of the border turned a blind eye, ensuring shipments arrived safely in exchange for bribes. Trucks carrying produce often hid cocaine, while human mullahs swallowed pellets of heroin to walk unnoticed through airports. The efficiency was staggering. Tons of narcotics could vanish from jungles in South America and reappear in U.S. cities within days. Each successful operation brought in millions, fueling bribes, weapons purchases, and expansion into new territories. Over time, these smuggling networks grew so sophisticated they resembled multinational corporations with managers, accountants, and logistics experts. What set them apart wasn't just their ruthless violence, but their unmatched ability to move the forbidden faster and more reliably than governments could stop them. Corruption at every level. The cartels could not have thrived without corruption. Bribes became as powerful as bullets, and money opened doors that violence alone could not. From low-ranking border guards to high-ranking politicians, everyone had a price. Police officers often turned into allies, warning traffickers of upcoming raids or deliberately losing evidence in exchange for stacks of cash. Judges released cartel members on technicalities, while politicians quietly accepted campaign donations stained with drug money. Even military units, tasked with destroying cartels, were sometimes found escorting their shipments instead. In Mexico and beyond, corruption ran so deep it blurred the line between government and organized crime. Entire towns were effectively owned by cartels, their mayors and police chiefs handpicked or threatened into obedience. Honest officials faced impossible choices: accept the bribe or face death. The phrase, plata o plomo, silver or lead, was more than a threat. It was the foundation of cartel power. This toxic mix of fear and greed made cartels untouchable, eroding trust in institutions and leaving ordinary citizens with nowhere to turn. In many regions, people knew the cartel's word mattered more than the law. It wasn't just a shadow government. It was the only government that truly worked for those who ruled with blood and money. Narco Wars. The rise of powerful cartels inevitably led to bloody wars. Rival groups fought for control of smuggling routes, known as plazas, which were worth billions of dollars each year. Entire cities became battlefields where convoys of armored trucks, machine guns, and grenade launchers replaced law enforcement. Streets ran red with blood as assassins carried out brutal executions designed to send a message: cross us and you will suffer. Innocent civilians were often caught in the crossfire, their lives shattered by a war they never chose. In places like Ciudad Juarez, violence reached such levels that the city was once labeled the murder capital of the world. The Mexican government tried to strike back with military operations, but each crackdown only sparked more chaos. Soldiers patrolling neighborhoods sometimes became targets themselves, while cartels adapted with guerrilla-style tactics. The war spread across borders, destabilizing entire regions, with Central America becoming a corridor of violence. The Narco Wars were not just about drugs. They were wars for power, fear, and absolute control. What made them especially terrifying was that victory was never final. When one cartel fell, another rose to take its place, continuing the endless cycle of bloodshed. For many, it felt less like a war and more like a permanent state of terror. Impact on society. The Narco Wars left scars that went far beyond the battlefield. Entire communities were torn apart as families fled their homes, turning once thriving towns into ghost cities. Children grew up surrounded by violence, their first memories marked by gunfire, sirens, and funerals. Schools closed in dangerous areas, and many young people, with no opportunities left, were drawn into the cartels themselves, lured by promises of money, power, or even just survival. Corruption seeped into daily life. Politicians, police officers, and even judges were often bought or threatened, leaving ordinary citizens with no one to trust. Businesses shut down under the constant threat of extortion, and fear became part of everyday living. For many, simple acts like driving at night or speaking out against the cartels could mean death. In border towns, families lived in constant anxiety, torn between hope for safety and despair over endless bloodshed. The culture itself began to shift with narco corridos, drug ballades glorifying cartel leaders as folk heroes, creating a dangerous cycle of admiration for violence. The impact on society was deep and lasting, shaping generations, destroying trust in government, and normalizing fear. The Narco Wars were not only fought with weapons, they were fought inside the hearts and minds of millions of people. Government crackdown. As the Narco Wars intensified, the government realized that ignoring the violence was no longer an option. Special anti-drug units were created, combining local law enforcement with military forces to target cartel operations directly. High-profile raids were carried out on known drug labs, warehouses, and hideouts, often resulting in intense firefights. Cartel leaders became prime targets, and some were captured or killed in dramatic operations broadcasted to the public. Laws were strengthened, introducing harsher penalties for drug trafficking, money laundering, and corruption. Border security increased, with checkpoints, aerial surveillance, and patrols attempting to disrupt the flow of drugs and weapons. Despite these efforts, the crackdowns were met with fierce resistance. Cartels adapted quickly, using new smuggling routes, bribes, and violence to maintain control. Civilians often found themselves caught in the middle, with neighborhoods turned into battle zones. While some successes were celebrated, like dismantling major trafficking rings, the struggle highlighted a deeper issue. The government alone could not end the war without broader social and economic reforms. The crackdown became a symbol of the ongoing struggle, a constant battle between law enforcement and an increasingly resilient enemy. Economic consequences. The Narco Wars didn't just bring violence. They tore through the economy as well. Local businesses suffered as extortion and protection fees became common, forcing many to close or operate in fear. Farmers were pressured to grow drug crops instead of food, disrupting the local supply chain and inflating prices. Foreign investment dwindled as international companies feared kidnappings, theft, and instability. Tourism, once a vital source of income for many regions, plummeted as news of cartel violence spread worldwide. Even banks and financial institutions struggled as money laundering became widespread and honest transactions were scrutinized or delayed. Families living in cartel-controlled areas found it difficult to earn a living legally, pushing some into the drug trade simply to survive. Inflation rose and unemployment climbed, creating a vicious cycle where poverty fed crime and crime fed poverty. Governments tried to implement economic programs, offering incentives for legal business and agricultural alternatives, but corruption and cartel interference often undermined these efforts. The economic impact of the Narco Wars proved that the damage went far beyond bloodshed. It weakened entire communities, leaving a lasting scar that would take generations to heal. Media and public perception. The Narco Wars captured the world's attention through constant media coverage. News outlets, both local and international, reported on gruesome violence, cartel showdowns, and government crackdowns, painting a picture of chaos and fear. Social media amplified the stories, with videos and images spreading rapidly, sometimes before authorities could confirm details. This constant exposure shaped public perception, making the violence feel closer and more personal, even for people living far from the affected areas. In some cases, the media unintentionally glamorized the cartels, highlighting their wealth, power, and influence, which fascinated young people and gave the organizations a notorious appeal. Families of victims often spoke to reporters, sharing their grief and frustration, humanizing the tragedy behind the headlines. Governments faced pressure to act, as the public demanded solutions and justice. Meanwhile, some journalists risked their lives to report the truth, exposing corruption and cartel operations, while others were silenced through intimidation or worse. The role of media in the Narco Wars was double-edged. It informed the public but also fueled fear, admiration for the cartels, and debates about morality, safety, and law enforcement effectiveness. Impact on children and education. The Narco Wars didn't just affect adults. It deeply impacted children and their education. Schools in cartel-controlled regions often faced threats, forcing many to close temporarily or operate under heavy security. Students grew up surrounded by fear, hearing gunfire and sirens as part of their daily lives. Some children were directly recruited into the cartels, either as messengers, lookouts, or even fighters, losing their childhood to a life of crime and danger. Families struggled to keep kids in school, fearing that attending classes could make them targets. Teachers faced immense pressure, sometimes coerced to report student information or comply with cartel demands, which affected the quality of education. Psychologically, children carried trauma, witnessing violence, deaths, and constant instability, which affected learning, social development, and mental health. Many turned to coping mechanisms, while others withdrew from community life entirely. NGOs and local organizations tried to provide safe spaces, counseling, and alternative activities, but resources were limited. The ongoing conflict created a generation growing up with normalized violence and insecurity, highlighting how deeply the narco wars reached into society's future, shaping both the minds and lives of the youngest victims. Cultural and social changes. The narco wars left a lasting mark on Mexico's culture and social life. Violence and insecurity changed how people interacted, moved, and lived daily. Communities became more insular, with neighbors wary of strangers and public spaces often avoided after dark. Traditional celebrations, festivals, and gatherings were affected, some were canceled or heavily guarded to prevent attacks. Music and media reflected the conflict too, with narcocorridos, songs glorifying cartel life, becoming both popular and controversial, influencing youth culture and social perceptions. Families adapted to constant threats, teaching children caution and survival skills from a young age. Social trust eroded, as cartel influence meant that people could not always rely on authorities or even neighbors for help. At the same time, some communities formed stronger bonds, supporting each other through difficult times and creating informal networks for safety and aid. Religion and faith sometimes provided comfort, guiding people through grief and fear. Overall, the narco wars reshaped social norms, cultural expressions, and daily routines, embedding the conflict deeply into the collective identity of affected regions. Government and policy response. The Mexican government responded to the narco wars with a mix of military action, law enforcement reforms, and social programs. Large-scale operations were launched to target major cartels, deploying army troops and federal police to regions plagued by violence. Governments tried to capture or kill cartel leaders, aiming to destabilize criminal networks, but this often led to power struggles and increased bloodshed. Policy measures included stricter anti-drug laws, enhanced border security, and efforts to combat money laundering and cartel finances. In some areas, local authorities were replaced or restructured due to corruption or cartel infiltration. Social programs aimed to reduce poverty, improve education, and provide alternatives for at-risk youth, recognizing that crime thrived where opportunities were scarce. However, the effectiveness of these policies varied widely, with some regions seeing temporary improvements and others facing ongoing instability. International cooperation, especially with the United States, played a key role in intelligence sharing, drug interdiction, and law enforcement support. Despite these efforts, the narco wars proved that policy alone could not fully eliminate the complex social and economic factors driving organized crime. Impact on tourism and economy. The narco wars in Mexico had a profound effect on the country's tourism and overall economy. Violence and high-profile cartel attacks created fear among tourists, causing many to cancel trips or avoid certain regions entirely. Cities like Acapulco, Ciudad Juárez, and parts of Sinaloa saw sharp declines in visitors, which hit local businesses, hotels, and restaurants hard. Tourism is a major source of income for Mexico, so these disruptions led to significant economic losses, especially in areas that relied heavily on foreign visitors. Beyond tourism, the broader economy also suffered. Cartel activity discouraged investment and slowed economic development in regions plagued by violence. Many businesses faced extortion demands or threats, forcing some to close or relocate. The instability also raised the cost of security for companies and individuals, adding further strain. On a positive note, some communities adapted by promoting safer areas, improving security measures, and focusing on cultural and eco-tourism to regain visitor confidence. Still, the lingering perception of danger continues to challenge Mexico's economic growth and reputation, showing how deeply the narco wars impacted both lives and livelihoods. Cultural influence and media portrayal. The narco wars have left a lasting mark on Mexican culture and global media. Cartel activity and the violence associated with it have inspired movies, TV shows, music, and literature, often portraying the dramatic rise and fall of drug lords. Popular series like Narcos, Mexico, and various narcocorridos, ballads glorifying cartel figures, have brought international attention to these events, shaping perceptions of Mexico. Within the country, the wars influenced local art, music, and storytelling, reflecting the fear, struggle, and resilience of communities living under constant threat. However, media portrayal is a double-edged sword. While it educates and entertains, it can also glamorize cartel life, creating controversial narratives that some argue normalize violence. Governments and activists have criticized such portrayals for overshadowing the human suffering and social consequences caused by the conflict. On the other hand, documentaries and investigative journalism aim to provide more realistic insights, highlighting both the political corruption and the bravery of law enforcement and civilians caught in the crossfire. Overall, the Narco Wars continue to shape Mexican identity and global understanding, leaving a deep imprint on culture and storytelling. Government response and policies. The Mexican government's response to the Narco Wars has been complex and often controversial. Over the decades, authorities have employed various strategies, including military interventions, targeted arrests of cartel leaders, and international cooperation, especially with the United States. The Kingpin strategy, introduced in the mid-2000s, focused on capturing high-profile cartel bosses, hoping to destabilize criminal networks. However, this approach often led to unintended consequences, such as increased violence, as factions within cartels fought for power. Governments also implemented social programs and community policing in affected areas, aiming to reduce recruitment into criminal organizations and provide economic alternatives. Policies targeting money laundering, arms trafficking, and drug production have been enforced, though corruption and bureaucratic inefficiencies sometimes undermined these efforts. International pressure, particularly from the U.S., influenced law enforcement strategies, intelligence sharing, and border security measures. Despite these efforts, the persistence of cartel influence highlights the difficulties in balancing strict law enforcement with social and economic reforms. The government's ongoing struggle reflects the complexity of combating organized crime in a country with deep-rooted systemic challenges, corruption, and widespread inequality.